And welcome back. We are now at the point where, if you remember, we have developed an input system where we can go ahead and start defining what that's going to look like. And so if we think about how we've done this in the past, how have we used the different properties of our character? Well, the way we did this was with the rigid body class. And if you remember, we have a rigid body 2D because it's a 2D object. And we want to be able to manipulate and control things using that rigid body. And so I'm just going to go ahead and call this one player rigid body, just so I can kind of keep track of what that is. And now that's set up, I can actually go into, for example, my start method and initialize that into a value. And so just like how we've done in the past, we're going to go ahead and call player rigid body. And we want to go ahead, and you can see Visual Studio is being very helpful here. We want to get the component of the rigid body 2D. And that's, of course, going to allow us to say, hey, we're going to get this component of rigid 2D. We're going to store it back in this player rigid body that we can then manipulate and use values for. Now, how do we go about actually doing that movement that we want to do is that we can go right into our update method. Of course, if you think about it, we want to have this player movement be updated continuously through like our keyboard presses and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and create a movement, or excuse me, a method that is going to control that movement. So for example, we can call this method player movement. Of course, you can see player move is a class that's already taken here. But if I call it like player move, I could do that. I could also call it, run, whatever you want. But again, we gotta just be careful sometimes because, as I start typing player movement, you can see it. So I'm going to call this one player run. And of course, it doesn't exist as a method yet. So it's going to say, hey, you want to generate a method? So yes, I'm going to go ahead and do that. And so here's my new method. So probably void throw method. I'm just going to delete this exception out of here. And what we want to do instead is have it very much effectively come in and update these things that we're handling with our rigid body. So if you remember, our rigid body is called the player rigid body. And what we want to do is change the velocity here. And so that velocity, of course, is the direction of which is going. So we're not just applying a speed, we're applying a direction here. And we actually want to set that to, actually we've already defined, you can see it's saying vector2.0. Well, up here we've already defined a vector2, which is our movement input. And so we can actually just define it right to that. And that should, of course, allow us to have that definition in place. And so now back in Unity, anytime we make big changes like this, we should probably make sure things aren't completely broken. So I'm just going to go ahead and run my game here. And so here's my player. You can see he's kind of moving a little slowly. I can, of course, move him around. I can do things like this. But he's kind of floating a little bit. I can also move him up and down, which is not necessarily something we really just want to restrict that to left and right movement. So we're going to have to do a little bit of work there. But we are getting keyboard input that is allowing us to slide that player around back and forth. So back in our player run method, I'm just going to go ahead and add in a new vector2 because, again, we want to define this a little differently from this vector2 we're doing up here. And let's just call this one since we have already a player movement and stuff like that, we'll call this one the player velocity. That sounds like a good one because that's ultimately what this is doing. And what we want to do is set this to a new vector2. We want to redefine this. And we want, of course, keep our x coordinate here. So we want our move input. So our movement input dot x. But I don't want movement input dot y because if we just have this y coordinate here, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to behave exactly the same way as how it did before. Instead, I want to make this into a 0 float value because remember, this is a float. And so that will pretty much keep it from being able to move up and down. We only want that to happen, for example, maybe if we're doing things like climbing a ladder. So in our general movement, though, we don't want that to happen. We want to be able to restrict their movement. And what we want to do is, because we're here changing the velocity with movement input, we actually now want to update this to be the player velocity. And that should, of course, update that. But anytime we make a change, remember, it's good to check. And so let's fire up Unity here again. Once again, go ahead and run that. Here comes our player. And so I can move left and right, but I can't move up and down anymore. So that is a good sign. So we've made some progress. We can see we still kind of have some floating action here. So it's not completely perfect. All right, so before I go ahead and show you how to do this, I want to go ahead and pause the video and give yourself a quick challenge. See if you can figure out how to address our two issues. One, of course, you notice is that our player, even though we can move left and right, is not moving very quickly. So how can we go ahead and affect and change that movement? The other thing, of course, is the ability for us to bring gravity back in the factor here. You can see that that player is still kind of floating down very slowly. It's not dropping straight down like we originally had it. So that's something that we also need to address. So go ahead, pause the video, take that challenge on, and let's then work through it together. All right, so if you guessed it, that you say, hey, I want to take on the challenge, what do I need? I need a serialized field. You are correct because we want to, of course, be able to have those kind of range of values in here. And let's go ahead and set this up as a float. And let's call this one the player speed. So we're going to just take the player speed and just set this, for example, equal to 10. That'll give us a nice good value to kind of start with here. And of course, now that we have this float here, we can, of course, affect this vector that we had previously made. So we have our movement speed, and we, of course, want to be able to change that or speed up or slow down. So let's go ahead and just add a multiplier here of our player speed, and that will allow us to control that in Unity. So if we want to go into our inspector and have the player move much faster, we can do that. Or if we want to go much slower, we can do that as well. So we have that ability to control that now. Now, of course, we still have to work on the gravity issue. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to take this back. Now, earlier, this was kind of suggested to us a little bit by the Visual Studio here, and say, hey, but we deleted it out because we didn't want to quite move that far ahead here. So we're going to call in our player rigid body that we had created here. And what we want to do is actually get the velocity that this is controlling, and we want to really narrow it down to just that y component. So if we look at this and we say, hey, we want the velocity, and we want just that y coordinate, that's going to restrict and say, hey, whatever velocity that you currently have, just keep that velocity. We don't need to change, we don't need to modify it, because when we say 0f, that is, of course, trying to override it. But here, it's going to keep that initial velocity that it has from that gravity fall, and so it's going to keep it in place. Now, the last thing we need to do, of course, is simply just come over here and test our game, make sure that everything is working correctly, and make sure I didn't miss anything. Oh, and our player fell, so that's awesome. And of course, now I can move. Oh, and you can see he's fallen down to the new platform here. I can't move up. I can't move down. Either, of course, you can see we're still getting input for it, which is great. But we are now restricted. And the one thing you'll notice, though, is that he is not turning around. For example, he is a little fast, so I might have to tune that a little bit. But he has not turned around to, if he moves to the left here, you can see he's pretty much just sliding backwards. So we're going to have to go ahead and adjust that. But, of course, now we have our next step here in our game. So this is, of course, pretty awesome.